This video demonstrates the use of the gradient editor, which is included with the optional Advanced Cross-Section module. Starting with a blank cross-section screen, we can access the gradient editor from the Options menu and then select the gradient editor. Looking at the gradient library section, we see a list of predefined gradients. These are the default or preset gradients that are installed with each RAOB program. Each of the gradients' names is preceded with the letter P, indicating its preset status. These preset gradients cannot be altered and then saved under the same name, but they can be saved using different names. But more about this later. For now, notice that these preset gradients are used for various toolbar parameters, such as cape, clouds, and contrails. And we'll soon see how to associate these gradients with specific toolbar analyses. But right now, we'll briefly review the basics of gradient editing. To create a new gradient, click on the New button, and then use the Add a Color button to select your first color. In this case, we'll select red. And before a gradient can be displayed, we must select another color. This time, we'll select green. Notice the midpoint pen below the gradient bar. It points to the midpoint or transition point of the two adjacent colors, red and green. Also notice that the midpoint pen is painted with these two colors. This pen has two functions. First, you can click and drag its position to alter the transition point of the two colors. And you can use the Evenly Spaced Midpoints button to reset its default location. Second, you can right-click the pen to flip the colors back and forth. And now let's add a third color, blue. And here we see another midpoint pen between the green and blue pens. Now we can demonstrate the color pens located above the gradient bar. Here we can click and drag the green pen, for example, to move the color's intensity point along the gradient bar, thereby creating differing color gradients. At the same time, the midpoint pens are automatically repositioned. And if we select the evenly spaced color bands, all pens are reset to their default positions. Now suppose we want to change the color of the green pen to yellow. Just right-click the green pen and select the new color. And if you want to delete a color, just click on the pen's eraser. And to save this gradient to file, use the Save As button. But to see how a gradient is used to paint a diagram, let's close the editor and load a previously created cross-section file. Here we have a distance-based cross-section diagram across the United States from the West Coast to the East Coast. So let's perform a temperature analysis. First, we'll call up the Analysis toolbar and then click the Temperature button. By default, RAOB is initially configured to just perform isopleth analyses. In order to perform colorized analyses with gradients, we can either use the Options menu, then the Color Analyses option, or select the Diagram options and view the Analyses tab, and then select the Colorized First Analysis option. Okay, now let's analyze temperatures again. And this time we see a painted gradient analysis. And here's the associated gradient color bar. In order to see how this particular gradient is assigned to the Temperature Analysis button, just right-click the Temperature button for Configuration Options. Here we see the Temperature Analysis Options box. The parameter options on the left side of this panel only apply to isopleth analyses, while the right side of the panel contains the gradient option. And here it says that the first parameter analyzed will be painted with the gradient pattern shown below. In order to change the gradient, just click on this button. And here again we see the gradient editor, but this time it opens with the gradient which is associated with the Temperature Analysis button, as seen here. It uses the default gradient, but any of these gradient library gradients can be assigned to any Analysis toolbar button. So let's make a change to this gradient to see how the editor works. And for demonstration purposes, let's begin with the middle color, which is a light green, which we want to change to white. Just right-click the mouse on the pen and select the white color, and now we see the altered gradient. Note that you cannot save this altered gradient with the same name, because the gradient names which begin with the P are reserved as preset gradients. Instead, we first need to give this altered gradient a new name. To do this, just click on the Save As button, where we'll enter TEMP as the new name, and then click on the OK button, which saves the altered gradient to the gradient library list. The last step is to now click on the Apply button to link this new gradient to the temperature analysis button, where now we see a representative mini gradient with the new white center color. So now just click on the Edit Box's OK button to complete the change. And now when we click on the toolbar's temperature button, we see our new gradient with white as the middle color. Okay, now let's go back to the gradient editor and restore the temperature's default gradient. Now it's time to try some other gradient modifications. Notice that this default gradient has smooth transitions between each color, and this is reflected by this smooth gradient type option as seen here. But suppose you want your gradient to show discrete color changes without gradual transitions. To do this, we use the Step option. Now we see that our gradient has distinct color changes between each color pen. You can also increase the number of transition steps like this for various display purposes. But for now, we'll just stay with the more common two-step mode. And so let's see what this step gradient looks like on the temperature analysis. And now we can see distinct temperature layers. And when we again click the temperature button, we see the temperature isopleths. But notice that there is no color difference either side of the -50 degree isopleth. We can fix this with the gradient editor, but first remember that the temperature isopleths range from +10 to -50. Okay, in order to specifically assign any color band to a specific temperature range, we now need to change from the automatic to the manual gradient scaling method. Note that the automatic method lets RAOB determine the maximum and minimum temperature range for analysis purposes, while the manual method only uses the range as specified by the user. So let's see how this works. Now we need to specify the minimum and maximum temperature range. But first remember that the temperature isopleths ranged from -50 to +10. Therefore, we need to add a 10-degree band on either side of the gradient to catch those boundary temperatures. So enter -60 and +20. And we'll use the standard 10-degree interval, and then apply. And here we see our temperature bands. But they do not exactly align with the color bands because we have 8 temperature bands and only 7 color pens. So we need to add one more color. Click on the Add a Color button, and let's use a pink color this time. And now we have perfectly aligned temperature and color bands. But suppose we want to put the pink color on the left side of the gradient. So instead of changing the colors of each pen, we'll just systematically move the pink pen to the left with these midpoint pens. Just right-click each pen and watch the pink pen move to the left. And now we're ready to save, and then apply this modified gradient and see how it looks on the diagram. And here we see the pink colors at the cold end of the gradient. And when we overlay the temperature isopleths, we now have distinct color separation for temperatures less than -50. Now let's try something different. Suppose we only want to color temperatures between -10 and -30 in a red color, leaving all else white. First, we'll need to get back to the gradient editor. Now we have gradient coloring of only the -10 to -30 temperature region. And now let's return to the gradient editor to review the last edit option. This time we'll look at the auto balance max min limits option. This option is only functional when the corresponding automatic gradient scaling is active, and this option should only be used with data containing positive and negative values. When the auto balance option is turned off, RAOB will paint gradients using the actual maximum and minimum values of the plotted data. When the auto balance option is turned on, RAOB first finds the largest absolute value of the plotted data and then forces the lesser value equal to the higher value and of the opposite sign. So let's see an example. We've selected the default gradient for crosswind and UV wind component analyses. By default, the auto balance function is turned on, but let's turn it off and see what the results look like. For this example, let's analyze the V component wind data. Notice that the range is from -20 to 43 knots, and the midsection of the gradient is at +12 knots. While the data is accurately painted, it's more visually significant to have the midsection of this gradient reflect the 0 knots data, or the inflection point between the northerly and southerly wind components. So back at the gradient editor, we'll recall the default wind component gradient, which has the auto balance function turned on. And now we can see that the northerly and southerly inflection white color is properly located at the 0 wind speed value. Before closing, just a quick note about the import and export buttons. They let you easily share your specially created gradients with other RAOB users. That completes the gradient editor video. Thank you for watching.